A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't saying nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a sound Jedediah knew better than any human voice, a constant companion that scoured the land and the soul with equal indifference. His homestead was a lonely outpost, a testament to endurance carved from dust and rock, backed against the foothills that bled into the unforgiving mountains. For 5 years, his world had been this. The creak of floorboards in his small cabin, the distant howl of a coyote, and the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting wood deep into the night, as if he could split his own guilt into manageable pieces. He was a man living in the long shadow of a memory, his silence a heavy blanket woven from remorse. His eyes, the color of a slate evening sky, were tired. They had seen everything he ever wanted, and then they had seen it all turn to dust. Each day was a ritual of work and quiet suffering, a penance he performed from the dusty sun of dawn until the last smoky lamp was extinguished. He thought this isolation was all he deserved. He thought it was all he would ever have. From his porch, he could see the skeletal remains of redemption, a town that had died of thirst and broken promises a decade ago. Its buildings slumped like weary shoulders, their windows vacant eyes staring into the dusty vastness. It was a place of ghosts, and for that reason, Jedediah felt a kinship with it. It understood silence, it knew loss. He rode past it sometimes, his horse's footsteps muffled in the thick dust, a lonely rider in a lonely land. He never stopped. There was nothing there for him but more emptiness, and he had his fill of that. His life was a slow, observational narration of chores, a routine built to keep the past at bay. But the past was a persistent creditor, and it always found a way to collect. The biting wind that stung his skin was a constant reminder of the coldness that had settled deep in his bones, a frost that no fire seemed able to thaw. He was numb, reclusive, a man who had walled himself off from the world. He was wrong. He had not known about the woman. He had not known about the child. From his vantage point, redemption was empty, a corpse of a town picked clean by scavengers and time. He had no reason to think otherwise. The discovery came by accident, a chance overhearing in the county seat, a town he visited only twice a year for salt, flour, and coffee. 2 men in dusty coats spoke of the redemption plot, a forgotten parcel of land being sold for a pittance to clear the county ledger. $100 for the whole damn town, one of them laughed. $100 for a patch of worthless dirt and rotting wood. For Jedediah, the words landed differently. $100 for a buffer, for a guarantee of absolute, uninterrupted solitude. It was an impulsive thought, a flicker of action in a life defined by stillness. It was the last of his money, saved for a new plow he desperately needed. But the idea of owning the silence, of making his isolation official and legally binding, was a pull he couldn't resist. He acted against his nature. He bought it. The clerk, a man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, barely looked up as he took the worn bills and pushed a dusty scroll across the counter. The deed to a ghost town. Jedediah rode back not with a sense of triumph, but with a feeling of grim finality. He had purchased his own tomb. He rode into the main street of redemption, the deed a brittle weight in his saddlebag, and reined in his horse. The silence was different now that he owned it, felt heavier, more profound. Then he heard it. It was not the wind. It was a cough, small and ragged, coming from the shadowed doorway of the old general store. He froze, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle horn. He dismounted, his footsteps in the dust making the only sound. In the doorway stood a woman, her frame thin, her dress worn down to threads. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, but her eyes, though overtired, were alert, watchful. Beside her, clinging to her skirt, was a small boy with hair the color of dry grass. The woman said nothing. She just watched him, her body rigid with a fear so deep it was almost calm. Jedediah had bought a ghost town. He had found a family still living there. Alara watched the man from the broken window of the general store. He was massive, a solid, weathered figure who seemed to have been carved from the same harsh earth as the mountains behind him. He had not spoken a word since his arrival 2 days ago. He had simply looked at her and the boy, his tired eyes holding an expression she couldn't decipher, and then he had retreated. He took up residence in the old livery stable at the far end of the deserted street, a ramshackle structure that offered little more shelter than her own. A silent treaty was drawn between them without a single word. He had the west side of the street. She had the east. This silent arrangement was a consequence of his sudden appearance, a separation born of her distrust and his apparent desire for solitude. She did not know what he wanted. Men who appeared out of nowhere rarely brought anything good. Her life was a rhythm of survival. Each morning, she would take Samuel, her son, and forage for what little the dry land offered. Hardy roots, bitter greens. She checked the snares she had hidden in the scrub, praying for a rabbit. Most days they came back empty. The man, this silent new owner of their desperate refuge, had a horse and a rifle. He represented a power she could not match, and that made him a threat. She watched him constantly, her senses honed by years of precarious living. She saw him chop wood with a deliberate, relentless pace. She saw him sit on the livery steps as the sun went down, a silhouette of concealed loneliness. He never looked her way, yet she felt his presence like a change in the air pressure before a storm. Samuel was afraid of him. He would fall silent whenever the man was visible, his small hand tightening in hers. She would whisper reassurances, though she had none for herself. One morning, she awoke to a strange sight. On the splintered porch boards sat a burlap sack. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She crouched, inching the door open, expecting a trap, a trick, but it was just a sack. Inside was flour, and beside it, a half-dozen potatoes, their earthy skins a promise of sustenance she hadn't dared to dream of. She scanned the empty street, her gaze flying to the livery. There was no sign of him. The dust was undisturbed. He must have come in the deep dark of the night, a ghost leaving gifts. Suspicion was a bitter taste in her mouth. Nothing was free. She knew that better than anyone. But Samuel was thin, his cough a persistent, worrying sound in the quiet nights. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She took the food inside. She did not know it then, but this was the start of his secret intervention, the first cautious gesture across the chasm of their silence. Jedediah saw her take the sack. He watched from a crack in the livery wall, his heart a heavy, unfamiliar weight. He had seen the boy's thinness, the raw hunger in his eyes, and it had stirred something deep within him, an echo of a pain he kept locked away. He remembered another child, another cough. He pushed the memory down, turning its energy into action. He was not a kind man, he told himself. He was a practical one. A starving woman and child on his land were a problem, a complication. This was simply the easiest way to manage it. It was a lie, and he knew it. This act of secret help was a betrayal of the numbness he had cultivated for so long. He was involving himself, and involvement was dangerous. It led to connection, and connection led to loss. Still, he could not stop. He was a man acting against his nature, driven by a remorse he refused to name. The days that followed fell into a new, unspoken routine. Jedediah would leave something on her porch before dawn. A brace of rabbits, a bundle of firewood, once a small tin of precious lard. He moved like a phantom in the pre-dawn gloom, his actions unobtrusive, his presence concealed. Alara, in turn, accepted these offerings with a rigid, silent caution. Her fear began to be replaced by a weary confusion. This man asked for nothing. He made no demands. He simply provided. One afternoon, while he was out checking the perimeter of his newly acquired land, she walked the length of the street, her heart pounding with a strange mix of terror and courage. She stopped before the livery. His horse, a sturdy bay, stood quietly in the makeshift corral. On a sudden impulse, she filled a tin cup from her own meager water barrel and left it on a post for the animal. It was a small gesture, an almost invisible acknowledgement. Quiet reply. This delicate balance of giving and receiving from a distance might have continued indefinitely, but the land had its own plans. The sky, which had been a clear, pale blue for weeks, began to fill with a heavy, slate-colored dread. The wind picked up, its mournful howl turning into a vicious shriek. A blizzard descended upon Redemption with shocking speed, burying the dead town in a suffocating blanket of white. For 2 days, the world was nothing but swirling snow and the biting wind. Jedediah stayed in his livery, the cold seeping through the cracked boards. Elara and Samuel huddled in the general store, the stove barely keeping the mortal chill at bay. The isolation that had been their norm was now absolute, enforced by the storm. And with the cold came the sickness. Samuel's cough returned, this time deeper, wetter. By the 3rd day, a fever was burning through his small body. Elara was terrified. She bathed his forehead with snowmelt, her hands trembling. He was fading, his breaths shallow and ragged. She was alone, trapped, helpless. The sound of his strained breathing was a torment, each gasp a testament to her failure. She had brought him to this desolate place, and now it was going to claim him. Through the roar of the wind, another sound reached Jedediah. He wasn't sure at first, thought it was just a trick of the storm. But then he heard it again, the boy's labored coughing, a sound carried on the wind like a prayer for help. He froze. It was the same sound, the same desperate, rattling breath that had haunted his dreams for 5 years. The memory of Anna, his daughter, rose up, raw and overpowering. He saw her small face, flush with fever. He felt the agony of his own helplessness. For a moment, grief paralyzed him. Then something else took over, a protective instinct, fierce and undeniable. He swallowed his past. He could not save his own child, but he would not stand by and listen to another one die. He gathered what he had: a pouch of dried yarrow for the fever, a small jar of pine sap salve for the chest. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and stepped out into the blizzard. The wind tore at him, stinging his skin, but he pushed forward, his massive frame a bulwark against the storm's fury. He crossed the street, each step a monumental effort in the deep snow. He reached the door of the general store and knocked, his knuckles striking the weathered wooden door. The sound was loud, intrusive, a violation of their silent contract. He did not wait for an answer. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, bringing the cold and the snow in with him. The silence inside was different. It was not the quiet of separation. It was the thick, heavy silence of shared, desperate worry. Elara flinched when the door burst open. She scrambled to her feet, placing herself between the intruder and her son, her body a fragile shield. But the look on the man's face stopped her. It wasn't greed or menace. It was a grim, focused urgency. His tired eyes were fixed on Samuel, and in their depths, she saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own fear. He held out the pouch and the jar, his gesture simple, direct. He spoke for the first time since his arrival, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. For the fever, he didn't ask permission. He walked past her to the small cot where Samuel lay, his breathing a painful whisper. For a moment, Elara's suspicion flared again. But then she saw his hands, large and calloused, as they gently felt her son's forehead. They were the hands of a man who knew this terrible ritual. For 3 days and 3 nights, they existed in that small, smoky room lit by a single lamp. The storm raged outside, sealing them in a world of their own. Jedediah did not leave. He brewed the yarrow into a bitter tea, patiently coaxing small sips past Samuel's dry lips. He rubbed the pine salve onto the boy's chest, his touch surprisingly gentle. He sat in a rickety chair by the cot, a silent, unobtrusive vigil, his weary shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that felt older than the storm. Elara watched him, her defenses slowly, painstakingly crumbling. He moved with a quiet deliberation, his every action calm and reliable. They barely spoke. Words were unnecessary. The shared space was filled with the sounds that truly mattered. the crackle of the stove, the howl of the wind, and the slow, agonizingly slow, easing of Samuel's breathing. In that crucible of sickness and fear, something broke open between them. The silence was no longer a wall. It was a shared blanket against the cold. On the fourth morning, the storm broke. A pale winter sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow-covered street. Samuel's fever was gone. He slept peacefully, his breathing deep and even. Alara stood by the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. She felt as if she, too, had passed through a fever dream. Jedediah stood, his joints cracking in protest. He looked from the sleeping boy to her. "He'll be fine now," he said, his voice still raspy. He turned to leave, to retreat back to his livery and the familiar solitude. But Alara spoke, her own voice unsteady. "Stay," she said. It was not a command, but a plea. "There's coffee," he hesitated, his hand on the door. He looked at her, at the raw gratitude in her eyes, at the way the morning light caught the lines of exhaustion on her face. He nodded once, a short, deliberate motion. He stayed. They drank the coffee from mismatched tin cups, the fragile silence now comfortable, a testament to the battle they had weathered together. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. The thaw came quickly, turning the pristine snow to mud and slush. With the cleared roads came a visitor. He was not a man of the frontier. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine wool coat, and he rode a horse too sleek for this rugged country. He dismounted in the center of town, his eyes sweeping over the sodden street with an air of arrogant ownership. This was Silas Blackwood, a land baron from the east whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and resentment across the territory. He held a sheaf of papers in his gloved hand. He saw Jedediah emerge from the general store, followed by Alara. A cruel, mocking smile touched Blackwood's lips. He had come to correct what he called a clerical error. The deed Jedediah held, he sneered, was worthless. The town of redemption and all the land it sat on was his. His gaze fell upon Alara and Samuel, who now clung to his mother's skirt. "And you?" Blackwood said, his voice dripping with contempt. "A squatter, and her brat. You have 1 hour to get off my land before I have the sheriff drag you off." Alara flinched as if struck. The words were a physical blow, stripping away the fragile dignity she had so carefully guarded. She instinctively pulled Samuel closer, her arm a tight band around his small shoulders. All the old fears came rushing back, cold and overwhelming. She was helpless again, a trespasser with no rights, no protector. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet the man's triumphant, cruel eyes, her silence now a cloak for her shame. The small, hopeful world she had begun to build in the last few days dissolved into mud and humiliation. The crowd was just one man, but his judgment felt as total and damning as an entire town's. She waited for the inevitable, for Jedediah to step aside, to acknowledge this man's power and wealth. After all, she was nothing to him. A stray he had shown a moment's kindness. But Jedediah did not move. He stood, a massive, unmoving rock against Blackwood's blustering storm. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was looking at Alara, at the way her shoulders trembled, at the fierce, protective curve of her body around her child. He saw not a beggar. He saw a survivor. He saw a quiet strength that shamed Blackwood's loud cruelty. In that moment, all his caution, all the walls he had built around his heart, turned to dust. The numbness in him was replaced by a slow, rising heat, a raw, protective anger. He turned his gaze to Blackwood, and the land baron took an involuntary step back. Jedediah's eyes were no longer just tired. They were filled with a cold, hard fire. He stepped forward, placing himself between Blackwood and Alara. He was silent for a long moment, letting the weight of his presence settle. Then the words came. They were not loud, but they carried the force of a final judgment, echoing in the stillness of the street. "She's with me," Blackwood scoffed. "With you? Did you buy her too? Along with this worthless scrap of paper?" The insult hung in the air, vile and sharp. Jedediah's expression did not change. He simply added, his voice low and firm, "Not bought. Chosen." The words landed with the impact of a stone dropping into a deep well. Chosen. The crowd of one fell silent. Blackwood sputtered, his blustering authority deflating under the weight of Jedediah's absolute certainty. He saw something in the silent rancher's eyes that his money and influence could not defeat. He saw a line that had been drawn in the mud, a line he did not have the courage to cross. With a final, venomous glare, Blackwood mounted his horse. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was profoundly different from the one he had found. Alara looked up, her eyes swimming with tears she refused to let fall. He stayed. He had stayed for her. That evening, the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. The threat of Blackwood lingered, a shadow on the edge of their minds, but the immediate crisis had passed, leaving in its wake an emotional rawness. They sat on the worn porch of the general store, the place where he had left his first secret offerings. The biting wind had softened to a gentle breeze that whispered through the dry grass. For a long time neither spoke. There were no words for what had happened. It had been a public declaration, a claiming, a salvation. Alara finally broke the silence, her voice soft, unsteady. She told him her story. She spoke of a husband who had promised her the world, who had followed the siren song of gold and left her and their son in a dusty boarding house with a promise to send for them. The letters stopped. The money ran out. Shame had driven her here, to this forgotten place, to wait for a man who was never coming back. Waiting had turned into surviving. Jedediah listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes. He just listened, his gaze fixed on the darkening hills, his presence a solid, calming anchor in the sea of her sorrow. He heard the exhaustion in her voice, the years of concealed pain, the quiet dignity of a woman who had endured the unthinkable. When she fell silent, the air was thick with her confession. He swallowed, the sound rough in the twilight. Then he spoke, his own voice thick with a grief he had never shared. He lifted a hand, not pointing, but indicating a low rise behind his livery, a place marked by a single, crude wooden cross almost invisible against the slate evening sky. "My wife," he said, the name a painful stone in his throat. "Sarah. And our little girl, Anna." He paused, the memory a physical weight. The fever took them, both of them. In the space of a week, he told her of his helplessness, of watching the two people who were his entire world slip away from him. He told her how he had buried them himself, with a shovel that felt heavier than any sin. He had come here to be close to them, to serve his sentence of solitude near their graves. He finished speaking, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the ghosts of their shared griefs. They were two people hollowed out by loss, who had found in this desolate place an unexpected mirror for their own pain. Alara looked at his weathered face, at the raw agony in his eyes, and she understood the source of his profound silence. She understood the impulse behind the flower, the firewood, the medicine. It was the kindness of a man trying to heal a wound in another that still bled in himself. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached out and touched his forearm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of communion. A simple, honest touch that said everything words could not. "You are not alone." He did not pull away. He simply nodded, a slow acceptance of her touch, of her presence. In that moment, on that dusty porch, two broken hearts acknowledged each other. They were no longer alone. Blackwood, it turned out, was a man of bluff and bluster. He never returned with the sheriff. His claim was a lie, an attempt to bully his way to more land, and Jedediah's unshakable stance had called his bluff completely. The passing of the threat left a new kind of quiet in redemption, not one of tension or avoidance, but of purpose. The next morning, Jedediah moved his few belongings from the livery stable into the small, dusty rooms in the back of the general store. No words were exchanged about it. It was a natural, unspoken evolution. They were a household now, They were a family. They began the slow, deliberate work of turning the ghost town into a home. They were strong together, their separate efforts braiding into a single, resilient rope. The rhythm of their days became a shared one. He began repairing the buildings, his hammer blows echoing through the street, a sound of renewal, not ruin. He fixed the leaky roof, mended the broken corral, and shored up the walls of the store against the wind. Alara, in turn, discovered a small, protected patch of earth behind the store and began to cultivate a garden. She found a deep satisfaction in turning the soil, in planting seeds, in coaxing life from the stubborn ground. Samuel, no longer a timid shadow, became Jedediah's apprentice. The big, silent man taught the small, curious boy how to check fence lines, how to read the clouds, how to whittle a piece of scrap wood into the shape of a bird. Their conversations were still simple, rooted in the practicalities of their life. "The north fence is down," he would say. "I saw a hawk circling," she would reply. Samuel needs new shoes, but beneath the plain words, a deeper connection was growing. He would watch her as she worked in her garden, her face calm and focused, and feel a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. She would watch him as he patiently showed Samuel how to hold a hammer, his massive hands gentle and steady, and her heart would feel a sense of safety she had never known. The dusty vastness of redemption began to feel less like an empty, abandoned stage and more like a canvas they were filling together. The silence was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but the comfortable, easy quiet of people who understand each other without the need for constant talk. The last of the winter snow melted, and a pale, watery spring sun began to warm the earth. The landscape, once a uniform brown and gray, began to show hints of green. The air lost its biting edge, carrying instead the scent of damp earth and new growth. One afternoon, Alara came inside to find Jedediah mending one of his worn shirts, his large fingers clumsy with the small needle and thread. She took it from him without a word and repaired it with neat, efficient stitches. When she handed it back, he simply nodded his thanks, but his eyes held a gentle, growing tenderness. He saw her worn-out shoes, the soles separating from the uppers. The next time he rode to the county seat, he returned not just with supplies, but with a pair of sturdy, reliable leather shoes. He left them by the door for her to find. It was his language. It was a language she now understood perfectly. The homestead thrived. They had a small flock of chickens, a cow, and a garden that promised a real harvest. Winter had passed. A true home was being born from the dust. Love, he was learning, did not always arrive with a thunderclap or a flash of lightning. Sometimes it grew in the silence, unobtrusive and steady, like a hardy plant taking root in rocky soil. It was nurtured not by grand declarations, but by small, honest gestures. A mended shirt, a cup of hot coffee, a shared look across a supper table. It was a quiet, deliberate thing, built of reliability and mutual respect. It grew where no one was looking, least of all the two people tending it. In the evenings, after Samuel was asleep, Jedediah took to sitting on the porch, a piece of seasoned oak in his hands. He would work with his knife, the blade moving with practiced skill, shaving away layers of wood to reveal the shape within. Alara would sit nearby, mending or simply enjoying the cool night air, the soft scraping of his knife a peaceful, rhythmic sound. She didn't ask what he was making. She knew he would show her when he was ready. One evening he finished. He stood and brought his creation into the warm, lamplit room. It was a rocking chair, small and perfectly proportioned, the wood sanded smooth as river stone. It was not ornate, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, in the honesty of its construction. It was a piece of himself, of his quiet, capable nature, given form. He placed it by the stove in the warmest part of the room. He didn't say, "This is for you," he didn't have to. He walked to the window and pushed it open, letting in the sweet scent of the spring night and the sound of crickets. He turned and looked at her. Her face, softened by the yellow light of the lamp, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Stay here," he said, his voice calm and certain. It was not a question or a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a truth that had grown between them as surely as the grass on the plains. This is home now. A gentle, growing smile spread across Alara's face, her eyes shining. She went to the chair and sat, the wood warm against her back. She rocked gently. She stayed. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. The story of Jedediah and Alara is not one of grand adventure or sudden fortune, but of the profound strength found in quiet dignity and the slow, patient rediscovery of human connection. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness, they found in each other a sanctuary. He, a man walled in by guilt, learned that redemption was not found in solitude, but in the protective embrace of another. She, a woman stripped of everything but her resilience, learned that trust was not a weakness, but the very foundation upon which a new life could be built. Their love was a testament to the power of small gestures, a language spoken in chopped wood, a mended roof, and a shared cup of coffee in the quiet dawn. It was a love that healed the raw wounds of the past and planted a garden in the barren soil of their lives. If this story touched you, like warm light finding its way into a cold and lonely room on a long winter night, then carry its message with you. Remember that even in the most desolate of circumstances, hope can take root. Remember that the deepest connections are often forged not in words, but in the silent, steady presence of someone who chooses to stay. It is a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of taking a step forward anyway, and that a home is not a place, but the feeling of being truly seen and accepted, flaws and all. The quiet heroes, the silent survivors, are all around us, their stories written in their weary shoulders and their tired, knowing eyes. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. These are the tales that remind us of the enduring power of the human heart to heal, to connect, and to build a future from the broken pieces of the past. And tell us in the comments what moved you the most. Was it Jedediah's secret kindness, Alara's resilient dignity, or the moment he stood before her and declared she was not bought, but chosen? We want to hear what resonated with you. We'll see you again, where silence means home.